I'll rewrite this story while preserving every structural element, fact, detail, and emotional beat, with a fresh voice that matches the original's raw, military, visceral tone. Girls don't belong here, desk jockeys like you are soft targets, don't cry when the recall smacks you in the face. My brother Jackson sneered those words 6 inches from my ear. He pressed his heavy frame against my back, crowding me at the firing line. The stench of sour sweat and stale coffee radiated off his overweight body as he forced my hands into a grip that would have jammed the slide and shattered my thumb. His howling laughter erupted first, then his middle-aged friends joined in, and the sound hit my chest like a cruel stab wound. A soldier's greatest pain doesn't come from the deafening shrapnel of an enemy. It comes from having your dignity trampled and stripped away by your own flesh and blood. I had bled for this country. I had been trusted with the lives of the most dangerous warriors on the planet. Yet coming home, my own brother treated me like a pathetic piece of trash, just to inflate his cowardly ego. The chain of patience, 10 years of playing the weak, desk-bound little sister, finally snapped. No tears, no arguments. Right through his arrogant laughter, I snatched the Glock and fired 5 lightning-fast rounds. The deafening roar tore through the room. The pungent smell of gunpowder filled my lungs. Then a deathly silence choked the entire shooting range. After my final shot left exactly one single hole, the range owner, a Delta Force veteran, shoved my brother aside. He checked the target, his hands trembling, his voice with absolute shock. "Ma'am, are you special ops?" Before continuing, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you really want to know the ending of this story. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. 2 days before that moment at the firing range, I parked my rattling 10-year-old Ford Ranger in my mother's driveway. The metallic crunch of gravel popped beneath the bald tires. Sitting next to my truck was my brother's lifted black Chevy Silverado. Punisher skull stickers covered the rear window. A thin blue line decal sat on the bumper. In my unit we called trucks like that pavement princesses. All show, zero substance, just like the man who drove it. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. Just 48 hours ago, these same hands were gripping an assault rifle in a classified combat zone on the other side of the world. I had carried a bleeding brother in arms 2 miles through a kill zone, his blood soaking through my fatigues while tracers snapped over our heads. Now I was sitting in a dented pickup truck, preparing to play the role of the helpless little sister. I shoved my dust-caked tactical rucksack deep into the truck bed, slung a cheap canvas tote over my shoulder, and commanded the captain inside me to vanish. Before stepping out, I pulled down the rearview mirror. A purple bruise, courtesy of flying shrapnel from that same operation, spread across my jawline like spilled ink. I scooped a heavy layer of cheap concealer onto the wound, pressing it into the tender skin until my eyes watered. My mother would have a heart attack if she saw it. She still believed I sorted supply crates in an air-conditioned warehouse on a base in Virginia. The concealer burned against the raw flesh, but that pain was nothing compared to what waited behind the front door. I flipped the mirror shut, grabbed the tote bag stuffed with a grocery store pie, and walked toward the house. Each step on that cracked concrete path was a conscious act of suppression. The smell of roast turkey hit me before I even touched the doorknob, thick and heavy, mixed with the overpowering cloud of my sister's Chanel perfume seeping through the screen door. I stepped through the front door into a barrage of psychological warfare more suffocating than any ambush I had survived overseas. My mother stood at the kitchen island, carving knife in hand, her eyes locking onto me with the precision of a laser sight. She scanned me head to toe, pausing on my bare ring finger. Before I could set the pie down on the counter, she launched the first volley. 32 and no husband, 32 and no children. Her friend Linda's daughter, 3 years younger, already had 2 kids and a house with a pool. My sister Blanca sat at the dining table in a silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly groceries. She lifted her left hand without a word, letting her new diamond ring catch the overhead light. The flash of it was a deliberate weapon, perfectly timed. I set the pie on the counter and said nothing. I swallowed the disrespect, anchoring myself to the last words my father ever whispered to me from his hospital bed, tubes running in and out of his frail body. "Keep your mother's heart safe." That promise was the only thing keeping my tongue behind my teeth. At the dinner table, my brother dominated every inch of airspace. Jackson was 46 years old, overweight, with a failed marriage behind him and a sales job that barely covered his truck payment. But in this house, he fancied himself the apex predator. He sat at the head of the table, our father's old chair, and waved the carving knife around like a scepter. He launched into a loud, rambling monologue about the modern military, jabbing the carving knife at the air like a pointer. The current generation of soldiers is soft, he announced, looking around the table for agreement. They spend more time on their phones than on the range. Real warriors are disappearing. He pointed the greasy carving knife directly at me. Perfect example right here. Logistics. A desk jockey counting socks and sorting boxes. He leaned back in the chair and crossed his thick arms. His friends at the gun club could outshoot any supply clerk 10 times over, he boasted. My mother nodded along, slicing her turkey into tiny, anxious pieces. My sister smirked into her wine glass. Nobody in this room had the faintest idea that the soft soldier sitting across from them had just carried a wounded operator 2 miles under enemy fire, applied a tourniquet with one hand while returning fire with the other, and called in a medevac helicopter while crouching behind a concrete wall that was disintegrating from machine gun rounds. I kept my mouth shut. I chewed dry turkey. I focused entirely on tactical breathing, 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out, to suppress the boiling urge to reach across the table and snap the carving knife out of his greasy fist. After dinner, the dishes sat in the sink, crusted with gravy. My mother retreated to the living room. My sister disappeared upstairs, probably photographing her ring from 9 different angles. I stood alone at the kitchen counter rinsing plates when my brother appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, picking turkey from his teeth with a fingernail. He wiped grease from his chin with the back of his hand, then crossed the kitchen and slapped my shoulder with agonizing condescension. The impact sent a jolt of pain straight through the concealed shrapnel bruise. I bit the inside of my cheek. He announced to the empty room, loud enough for our mother to hear, "I'll take you to the range this weekend, show you what real men do. I promise not to let you shoot your own foot off." He grinned, supremely satisfied with himself, waiting for me to either protest or grovel. I looked down at my plate, giving him one final chance to be a real family member, one final chance to see me as something other than a prop for his ego. He didn't take it. I dried my hands on a dish towel, folded it neatly and placed it on the counter. I forced a weak, submissive smile. "Yeah, I'm probably rusty." He laughed, slapped my shoulder again and walked out of the kitchen whistling. He had no idea he had just handed me the invitation to his own funeral. The silence in my cheap apartment hit me at 3 in the morning. It was more suffocating than incoming mortar fire. My shirt clung to my body, soaked in adrenaline-fueled night sweats triggered by that dinner interrogation. Every condescending word replayed in my skull on a torturous loop. My mother's disappointed scan of my empty ring finger, my sister's deliberate diamond flash, my brother's greasy carving knife pointed at my face like a verdict. I swung my legs off the thin mattress, bare feet smacking the cold concrete floor, and walked into the harsh fluorescent light of my bathroom. I stripped off my sweat-soaked shirt and faced the woman in the mirror. She was not a spinster clerk. The jagged bullet graze crossing my left shoulder told a story that nobody at that dinner table would ever be cleared to hear. I traced the scar with my fingertip, and the touch yanked me backward in time. A rooftop in a country I can never name. The crack of a sniper round passing so close it split the air beside my ear and carved a burning groove through the meat of my deltoid. My team medic, a kid from El Paso who kept photos of his daughter taped to the inside of his helmet, stitched the wound shut with no anesthetic while I continued calling fire coordinates into the radio. Blood running down my arm, pooling in the crease of my elbow, dripping onto the concrete. I did not stop transmitting. The fire mission saved 11 men pinned in a courtyard below. That was the night I earned my second Bronze Star. The medal sat in a locked drawer in this apartment, wrapped in a sock, buried under old tax returns. I lowered my eyes to the burn scar crawling up my thigh. That one was worse. That one lived in my sleep. An overturned tactical vehicle on a road outside a village I promised myself I would forget. A fuel fire erupting inside the cabin. 3 of my men screaming, their voices cracking through the flames. The smell of burning rubber and scorched flesh filling the air, so thick I gagged through my balaclava. I dragged them out one by one with my bare hands. The melting nylon of my pants fusing with the skin on my thigh, the heat so intense it turned the air in my lungs into broken glass. All 3 survived. I spent 6 weeks in a military hospital with skin grafts on my leg, telling my mother over the phone that I had twisted my ankle during a supply run. She told me to be more careful in the warehouse. I hung up and stared at the ceiling tiles until the morphine pulled me under. The combination for that extraction sat in the same drawer as the Bronze Star. My family saw a lonely, unmarried woman who counted boxes for a living. The mirror saw a decorated combat officer who carried the weight of classified violence on her body like a second skin that never shed. I picked up my phone from the edge of the sink and opened the encrypted banking app. The checking account read $2,400, enough to look broke, enough to keep the cover story breathing. I swiped to the hidden portfolio. Savings, $485,000. $10 years of hazard pay, deployment bonuses, combat stipends, and black budget payments for operations that officially never happened, all stacked neatly in an account invisible to civilian banking searches. I stared at the number glowing in the dark bathroom. I had enough liquid cash to buy my brother's Silverado, pay off his mortgage, and burn his house to the ground just to keep warm. He spent his weekends bragging about a $47,000 truck he was still making monthly payments on, sweating every time the credit card statement arrived. I could write a check for 10 of those trucks and not lose sleep. But the mission was never about money. The mission was restraint. The mission was to remain invisible until the exact moment I chose otherwise. I turned off the phone screen, plunging the bathroom into total darkness. I stood there in the silence, feeling the cold tile bite the soles of my feet, letting my pulse settle. I lived by the doctrine of the invisible man. My instructors at Fort Bragg drilled it into our skulls during the first week of Special Forces selection, back when I was the only woman in a class of 64 candidates. 39 washed out. The ones who bragged went first. The ones who flashed credentials got recycled. Flashiness is a vulnerability. The loudest man in the room is the easiest target and the first to die. My brother needed his lifted truck, his Punisher stickers, and his pristine tactical vest because he was completely hollow inside. He needed the world to see a warrior because underneath the costume there was nothing but debt, divorce papers, and a gut that hung over his belt buckle. I did not need to wear my resume on my sleeve. I did not need applause from people who confused noise with strength. I had buried men who were stronger than my brother would ever pretend to be. Folded their flags, handed them to weeping mothers, and I did it all without posting a single photograph. I walked into the dark bedroom and knelt beside the heavy steel safe bolted to the floorboards. 6 digits. I punched them in from muscle memory, not even looking at the keypad. The steel door groaned open, and the thick smell of gun oil and carbon flooded my nostrils, familiar and steadying, like the handshake of an old friend who never lies. Resting on the grey velvet lining was my custom-machined Glock 34 Gen 5. The frame was stippled by a master gunsmith in North Carolina. The trigger had been polished to a crisp, clean 2-pound break. The competition red dot sight, mounted on the slide, cost more than my brother's entire tactical wardrobe combined. I pulled the weapon out, wrapping my fingers around the polymer grip with the automatic precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times in 10,000 dark rooms across the world. I dropped the magazine. I racked the slide. The cold mechanical clack echoed through the empty apartment, sharp and absolute, the only standing ovation I ever needed. I dry-fired once, feeling the trigger reset against my fingertip, the crisp snap of the striker falling forward on an empty chamber. Muscle memory. Controlled breathing, perfect stillness, the same ritual I performed before every mission. He wanted to see firepower. He wanted to teach his soft little sister how to handle a big, scary gun. I seated a fully loaded magazine into the grip, placed the Glock into my unassuming black range bag and zipped it shut. I set the bag by the front door like a packed parachute, waiting for the green light, and walked back to bed. Sleep came easy that night. The counteroffensive was loaded and ready to deploy. The day after that Thanksgiving dinner, I stood deep inside a heavily fortified JSOC SCIF, a windowless concrete bunker buried beneath a military installation that did not appear on any public map. The air conditioning pumped a steady 65 degrees, chilling the sweat on the necks of the men around me. Banks of classified server racks hummed behind reinforced walls, their blue indicator lights blinking in steady mechanical rhythm. Encrypted monitors cast the room in cold, harsh light. No windows, no daylight. Time did not exist in here, only the mission existed. I stood with my hands clasped firmly behind my back, boots planted shoulder-width apart, spine locked, my eyes tracking a live satellite feed on the main screen. The grainy image showed a compound 11,000 meters away, and inside that compound sat a man responsible for the deaths of 4 American soldiers. I issued the command with quiet authority. Target confirmed. Alpha element breach. Bravo hold security. The room erupted into controlled, silent motion. Chairs scraped back against the polished concrete floor. Gear clinked against body armor. 12 of the most lethal operators on the planet, Men from Delta Force and the Ranger Regiment moved with absolute synchronization, executing their assigned roles without a single wasted word. These men did not look at me like a frail sister. They did not see a spinster. They did not see a warehouse clerk who counted socks for a living. They looked at a captain who had earned her seat at the head of this table through blood sacrifice and proven judgment under fire. Their trust was not inherited. It was not given by last name or gender. It was forged in shared foxholes and body bags and screaming helicopter rides where we gripped each other's gear and promised to bring everyone home. I had made calls that sent men through doors they might not walk back out of, and every single time, every single operator came home breathing. That record was my resume. That record was my ring. It did not sparkle under kitchen lights. It did not impress my mother, but it kept people alive. And in my world, that was the only currency that mattered. The operation unfolded on the satellite feed with surgical precision. Phase 1 clean, Phase 2 clean, extraction clean, and then a harsh vibration shattered the focused silence of the room. My personal cell phone buzzed on the steel briefing table. Every operator in the room glanced at it. The screen lit up with a text message from my brother. I read the words without touching the phone. Wear sneakers tomorrow, no high heels, 9 recall is no joke. I don't want you falling on your face. The message sat on the glowing screen like a crude joke scrolled on a bathroom wall. My sergeant Miguel, a man built like a concrete bunker with hands the size of dinner plates and a neck thicker than my thigh, leaned over from his chair and read the screen. His jaw tightened so hard the muscles in his temple jumped. The vein running down his neck pulsed. He let out a low, disgusted scoff that bounced off the concrete walls. High heels, he muttered, shaking his head slowly. Does he know about the boss's 800-meter shot in a 40-mile-per-hour crosswind? Civilian megalomania. The dumber they are, the more they think they know. A few of the operators around the table exchanged flat looks. Nobody laughed. These men had watched me put a round through a man-sized target at 800 meters in wind conditions that would make most military snipers call off the shot. They had seen me lead raids. They had seen me drag their wounded brothers out of burning wreckage with bare hands, my gloves melting off my palms, blistering. The idea that some overweight civilian was sending me footwear advice about recall was not comedy. It was an insult that landed on every operator in that room because an insult to their commander was an insult to every mission they had bled for. Miguel's hand curled into a slow fist on the table. He looked like he wanted to drive 4 hours and put my brother through a sheetrock wall. I picked up the phone and slid it into my tactical pocket without typing a response. I looked at Miguel, my expression entirely flat, suppressing a wave of familial exhaustion that 10 years of tactical breathing could never fully dissolve. He thinks I count socks for a living, Miguel. The sergeant stared at me for a long beat, his expression a controlled mixture of loyalty and outrage. I turned back to the satellite feed. The compound was empty. The mission was complete. Not a single American casualty. My team had executed with the cold, efficient precision that my brother would never understand, because he had never risked a single thing in his comfortable, loudmouthed life. His illusions were running on borrowed time. The school of reality was about to open its doors, and the tuition was going to be paid in full. Saturday morning came fast. My brother laid on his horn outside my apartment complex at 7:30, rattling the thin windows and sending a pair of pigeons scattering off the stairwell railing. I grabbed my unassuming black duffel, the one hiding $40,000 worth of precision firearm, and walked out into the parking lot. He sat behind the wheel of his Chevy Silverado with the engine growling, one thick arm hanging out the open window. He was wearing a brand-new, rigid tactical vest strapped over a tight black t-shirt that struggled to contain his gut. The nylon had factory creases still pressed into the front panels, sharp and clean, never once touched by dirt, sweat, or the blood of a friend. I noticed the price tag still dangling from the inner collar strap. He had not even bothered to cut it off. The vest alone told me everything, a man who buys gear to feel powerful rather than to survive contact. In my world we had a word for that kind of man, but I kept it behind my teeth. His eyes scanned my outfit as I approached the passenger door. Grey sweatpants, faded trail running shoes with a hole forming at the left toe, a plain black hoodie. My range bag slung across my shoulder like a gym bag full of dirty laundry. Nothing tactical, nothing impressive, nothing that screamed threat. That was the entire point. He leaned out the window, his lip curling upward with practiced disdain. Looking a little flimsy, he sneered, letting his gaze drag from my worn-out sneakers all the way up to my face. Going to yoga. I climbed into the passenger seat without a single word, pulling the heavy door shut with a solid thunk. The cabin reeked of cheap cologne layered over old fast food wrappers crammed into the door pockets. A pair of mirrored sunglasses sat on the dashboard next to an energy drink can. I set my bag between my feet, buckled my seat belt, and settled into the stiff leather seat. He did not buckle his. He put the truck in drive and peeled out of the parking lot, tires chirping on the asphalt, already talking before we reached the first traffic light. For 45 agonizing minutes, I became a prisoner of war inside his rolling ego chamber. He delivered a relentless, rambling lecture about firearms that he had clearly assembled from internet forums and podcast clips, consumed during his long daily commute to a sales job he barely tolerated, and was one missed quarter away from losing. He called 9 rounds plastic toys, and practically worshipped .45 caliber ammunition like it had been handed down from God on a stone tablet. He claimed any real warrior shoots .45 because the stopping power was undeniable, and anyone who carried a 9 was either scared of recoil or didn't understand terminal ballistics. He actually used that phrase, terminal ballistics, a term he had clearly memorized from a YouTube thumbnail without understanding a single variable behind it. My brain automatically ran the actual calculations, the ballistic coefficients, the muzzle velocity comparisons, the kinetic energy formulas that proved every single one of his claims completely wrong. These were calculations I had applied in real combat to determine which round would penetrate level 4 body armor at 300 meters and which round would bounce off like a thrown rock. But I kept my mouth sealed. I stared out the passenger window. I watched gas stations and strip malls and trailer parks blur past on the county road and practiced my tactical breathing. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. The discipline required to sit in that passenger seat and swallow his ignorance without responding was harder than any enemy contact I had ever survived. Enemies at least I was authorized to engage. Family required a different set of rules. Then he escalated beyond annoyance into genuine danger. The needle on the speedometer crept past 65, pushed past 70 miles per hour on a 2-lane county road with no median and oncoming traffic whipping past every few seconds. His phone sat in his lap, the screen glowing with an incoming message. He glanced down at it, and then he entirely let go of the steering wheel with both hands to type a response, both hands off the wheel at 70 miles per hour. The truck immediately drifted hard toward the right shoulder, and the rumble strips growled beneath the passenger side tires, vibrating through the floorboards and up through my boots and into my spine. I gripped the grab handle above the door with my right hand, knuckles white. My feet braced hard against the floorboard. I calculated the exact angle I would need to lunge across the center console and seize the wheel to prevent a catastrophic rollover at this speed and weight. I mapped the ditch. I mapped the oncoming lane. I prepared for emergency vehicle extraction. He finished typing his text and casually grabbed the wheel with one hand, yanking the Silverado back into the lane without even a glance in my direction. "This is warrior mindset," he boasted, his eyes still half on the phone screen, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just come within 3 feet of killing us both. Multitasking. The man had no combat driving training, no emergency vehicle certification, no situational awareness beyond his own reflection in the rearview mirror. He had a podcast subscription and a lifted truck, and he genuinely believed that made him a warrior. He was right about one thing: he was dangerous, but not in the way he imagined. He was dangerous to every single person sharing the road with his reckless, delusional self. The range was 20 minutes away. He used every remaining second of those final miles to fill the cabin with his absolute conviction that I would fail at the shooting range. He jabbed his thick finger at the dashboard. "You got to barely put your finger on the trigger, Betty. And whatever you do, hold your breath tight right before you shoot so you don't flinch." Every word out of his mouth was fundamentally, catastrophically incorrect. Then he finally put the phone down and gripped the wheel with one thick hand, leaning his bulk toward me, pressing against the center console until his shoulder touched mine. He looked at me with a pity so thick it curdled the air between us. "You're a woman, a soft target," he said, his voice dropping low like he was sharing classified intelligence with a child. "Loud noises, you'll freeze, panic, it's biology." He said that word, biology, with the absolute certainty of a man who had never opened a textbook but had watched enough clips on his phone to believe he had a doctorate. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. The familiar metallic sting grounded me. It reminded me I was alive, disciplined, and operating within a mission parameter, that had a rapidly approaching expiration date. He was not just being annoying anymore. He was not just being a bad driver or a loudmouth or a know-nothing playing dress-up. He was systematically stripping away my dignity layer by layer, using my gender as a crowbar, using his age and his volume and his physical size to crush someone he believed was beneath him. A soldier can eat dirt and take shrapnel and bleed in silence. That is training. But having your own blood eradicate your worth, reduce your entire existence to a chromosome, that was a poison with no antidote and no field manual. I reached down and tightened my seat belt across my chest, pulling the strap until it pressed flat against my sternum. I looked straight ahead through the windshield at the road unrolling before us. This was no longer a family favor. This was no longer a sister indulging her older brother's brittle ego. This was a targeted operation. And the target had just pulled into the parking lot. The Patriot Range was a low, flat concrete building sitting behind a gravel parking lot filled with oversized trucks and faded political bumper stickers. The concussive boom of indoor gunfire rattled through the walls, muffled but persistent, as we pushed through the heavy double doors. The smell of airborne lead and spent gunpowder hit me the moment I crossed the threshold. Sharp and familiar, a smell that most civilians flinch from, but that my nervous system processed as home. My brother's buddies were already clustered at lane 4, a group of 4 middle-aged men in cargo pants and baseball caps, each one wearing some piece of tactical gear that had never seen anything more intense than a weekend barbecue. They slapped my brother on the back like he was returning from overseas deployment. Then they turned their eyes on me. The first one called me sweetheart before I even set my bag down. The second looked me up and down slowly, from my worn sneakers to my baggy hoodie, and smirked like I had wandered into the wrong building. My brother puffed out his chest, his tactical vest creaking against the factory stiffness, and introduced me to the group with a wave of his meaty hand. He told them I was a little sister he had pulled from the warehouse to get some fresh air. They laughed, every single one of them. A chorus of dismissal from men who had never fired a weapon under pressure, never felt the ground shake beneath their boots from an incoming mortar, never held a dying friend's hand, and lied to his face that he was going to make it. I set my black duffel down on the wooden bench behind the firing line. My face was completely blank. No anger, no hurt, just the flat cataloguing expression of an officer assessing a room. I counted every exit, every fire extinguisher mount, every body position on the firing line, every potential threat, and every potential cover point. Force of habit. Force of years of training that had turned threat assessment into an involuntary reflex as automatic as breathing. My brother stepped up to the firing line at lane 4. The paper target hung exactly 7 yards downrange, roughly 21 feet. In my unit we called that breath-smelling range, close enough to count the target's teeth, close enough that missing at this distance would earn you remedial training and the kind of unit-wide ridicule that would follow you for the rest of your career. He picked up a rental Glock 19, slapped a magazine into the well and squared his body to the target. His stance was a catastrophic failure of fundamental marksmanship. He leaned backward on his heels, shifting his center of gravity behind his hips, which meant every round of recoil would push him further off balance rather than being absorbed through his frame. His left hand wrapped underneath the magazine base plate in a textbook teacup grip, a technique so outdated and dangerous that my instructors used photographs of it during basic firearms courses as a joke. He yanked the trigger with raw, uncontrolled force. Bang, the muzzle flipped wildly toward the ceiling. Bang, his wrist buckled under the recoil. Bang, his entire upper body rocked backward half a step. The muzzle climbed with every shot because he was fighting the weapon instead of managing it. He emptied the magazine in a chaotic burst of uncontrolled noise. Hot brass casings pinging off the concrete partition walls and scattering across the floor like dropped coins. He hit the button to retrieve the target. The motor hummed, pulling the paper back on the overhead rail. He turned around with sweat pouring down his flushed red face, breathing like he had just sprinted 100 meters. The paper came gliding in, and he snatched it off the clip, holding it up for his friends with both hands like a trophy. He launched into a breathless, arrogant speech about taming the beast of the recoil. I looked at the paper. The grouping was a disaster. 3 holes were punched wildly off to the left, scattered across the shoulder and arm area of the silhouette. 2 rounds had missed the paper entirely, punching through nothing but empty air and embedding themselves in the rubber backstop somewhere behind the target. At 7 yards, he had missed a stationary piece of paper at 21 feet. His friends erupted into applause and chest bumps, whooping and slapping his back like he had just won a national marksmanship title. Not one of them looked at the actual target. Not one of them noticed the 2 holes that were not there. They were cheering for noise, not accuracy. I sat on the bench, my hands resting calmly on my knees, and said nothing. My brother drank in the applause, his chin lifted, his chest swelling inside that creased tactical vest. Then he turned and pointed at me, signaling my turn with the slow, theatrical condescension of a king granting a peasant permission to approach the throne. I stood up from the bench and stepped toward the firing line. I pulled my Glock from the bag with a smooth, practiced motion. Instantly, my brother crowded my space again, pressing his bulk against my back, hovering his thick hands over my shoulders. He reached around me, adjusting my elbows outward, repositioning my wrists at angles that would have jammed the slide against my thumb, pushing my head forward until my chin nearly touched the rear sight. Every correction was wrong. Every adjustment would have caused a malfunction, a miss, or a broken bone. He leaned close to my ear, his breath hot and sour with stale coffee. He whispered his advice with the gravity of a war council, delivering a final battle plan. Hold your breath. Hold it until your face turns blue. Behind us, one of his friends leaned against the concrete partition wall and chuckled loud enough for the entire lane to hear. $20 says she drops the gun. The others snickered. They were placing bets on my humiliation. They were turning my life's deadly profession into a cheap carnival game to stroke their soft, untested egos. I tightened my grip on the polymer frame, feeling the stippled texture bite into my palm like a familiar promise. My jaw locked, my shoulders dropped, and my pulse, instead of spiking the way a civilian's would, dropped. It always dropped before engagement. It was the oldest trick my body knew. My endurance protocol was officially terminated. If you've ever had to bite your tongue while a group of incompetent people tried to explain your own life to you, hit the like button right now, and tell me in the comments what was the exact moment you finally decided to stop playing the victim. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. The laughter behind me faded into a dull, underwater hum. The range noise dimmed. The chatter dissolved. My heart rate, which had been held at a disciplined 70 beats per minute through hours of provocation, dropped, 65, 60, resting combat pulse. My breathing shifted into a rhythm that had been drilled into my muscle memory over a decade of relentless live-fire repetition. The timid Clark, the quiet little sister, the woman who had nodded and smiled and swallowed every insult since walking through her mother's front door, shattered into dust. She was gone. What remained standing at that firing line was something my brother had never met, something he had never imagined existed. Captain Mitchell. I pivoted on my right heel. My left hand snapped outward like a viper striking from grass. I caught his wrist in midair, my fingers locking around his forearm, halting his reaching hand and his entire body with a single controlled motion. The grip was precise, not violent, not showy, just a hard, practiced lock that communicated one unmistakable message: do not touch me again. Don't, I said. The word came out flat, low, and absolute. It was not a request. It was not Betty's voice. It was the razor-edged command of an officer who had issued orders over gunfire and the screams of wounded men and the roar of helicopter blades, and who had never once needed to repeat herself. My brother froze. His mouth hung open. His eyes widened as he looked into my face and collided head-on with something that made his nervous system lock up in primal, animal fear. The 1,000-yard stare. The dead, hollow gaze of someone who has orchestrated the end of human lives. Someone who has looked through a rifle scope and made a decision that cannot be reversed. He had never seen it before, not in person, not outside the movies he watched from his couch, but his body recognized it. Every mammal on Earth recognizes the eyes of an apex predator. You are standing in my workspace, I commanded, my voice dropping a full octave, cutting through the ambient range noise like a blade through paper. Step back. He stumbled backward, his boot catching on a spent brass casing, nearly losing his balance. His friends went dead silent behind him. The laughter was gone. The $20 bet was gone. The smirking was gone. They stood flat-footed and slack-jawed, staring at a woman they had dismissed 30 seconds ago, now watching her radiate a controlled, terrifying authority that none of them had ever encountered, and none of them could name. I turned back to the firing line. I rolled my shoulders once, releasing the last stored tension. I punched out the Glock into a perfect, aggressive isosceles stance. Both arms extended, elbows locked, shoulders driven forward, absorbing the recoil before it even began. My feet were shoulder-width, knees slightly bent, weight on the balls of my feet. My dominant eye picked up the red dot floating effortlessly over the center X of the paper target like it was magnetized. The target was 7 yards away, 21 feet, a distance I could cover in 2 strides, a distance where I had been trained to place every single round through the same hole. I exhaled naturally, riding the bottom of my breath. I pressed the trigger, not yanked, not pulled, pressed, smooth, deliberate, surgical, bang. The recoil traveled straight down my wrists, through my locked arms, down my rigid spine and into the concrete floor beneath my boots. The muzzle snapped back to center in a fraction of a second. The red dot settled. Bang, same hole. The brass casing pinged off the partition wall and hit the floor, spinning. Bang, the muzzle snapped back. The dot found the center X again instantly. Bang, bang. I ripped off 5 total rounds with split times under 0.2 of a second between each shot. 3 seconds start to finish. The slide locked back on an empty magazine with a sharp metallic snap. The last brass casing tumbled through the air and clinked against the concrete floor, rolling in a slow circle before settling into silence. The entire firing range had gone quiet. Not just our lane. The lanes on both sides had stopped shooting. Heads turned. A man 2 lanes down lowered his rifle and stared. The concussive echo of my 5 rounds hung in the air like a held breath. And then it faded, leaving behind a silence so thick and heavy, it pressed against the walls of the building. I dropped the magazine with a press of my thumb. I racked the slide, clearing the chamber. I placed the weapon on the bench, muzzle pointed downrange, slide locked back. Safe, professional, textbook. My brother's hand shot to the retrieval button and slammed it. The motor hummed. The paper target came gliding toward us on the overhead rail, sliding out of the shadows and into the fluorescent light. He squinted at the paper, tilting his head, his face cycling through confusion, then denial, then a desperate, sickening smile as he tried to salvage his shattered ego from the debris. "You missed," he stammered, the words tumbling out of his mouth like a drowning man grabbing at floating wreckage. "Missed 4 rounds. He assumed that at 7 yards there should be 5 distinct, separate holes scattered across the target. 5 bullet holes like the ones he had sprayed across his own target, each one in a different zip code. He was looking at one single, jagged hole punched dead in the center of the X-ring. 1 hole, not 5. One because all 5 of my rounds had tracked through the exact same trajectory, each bullet following the path of the one before it, widening a single ragged wound in the paper rather than creating separate impacts. The precision required to achieve that at combat speed was not something a weekend warrior could comprehend. It was not something most military shooters could achieve. It was the signature of a professional who had spent a lifetime perfecting the craft of putting metal on target. I pulled off my ear protection slowly and let it hang around my neck. I looked him dead in the eye, holding contact without blinking, without smiling, without offering him a single millimeter of comfort. "The sights are perfect," I said, my voice calm and steady and completely void of emotion. "And never tell a soldier to hold their breath in a firefight. That's the fastest way to die." His face drained of color. His friends behind him did not move. Nobody spoke. The man 2 lanes down was still staring. The only sound was the faint mechanical hum of the ventilation system cycling stale, gunpowder-thick air through the building. Then heavy boots crunched against the scattered brass casings on the concrete floor. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and carried the weight of a man who had walked into worse rooms than this one and walked out with fewer fingers. The range owner, a barrel-chested man in his mid-50s with a grey buzzcut and a face carved from decades of sandstorms and sleepless operations, marched straight toward our lane. I knew who he was the moment I heard his gait. The cadence, the weight distribution, the way his boots struck the floor heel first with military precision. A Delta Force veteran, the old breed, the kind of man who had done things that would never be written down and had paid for it with pieces of his body. My brother spotted him coming and his eyes lit up with desperate, pathetic relief. He saw the range owner as a lifeline, an authority figure who would surely validate his version of reality, who would pat him on the back and tell him the little sister had just gotten lucky. He stepped forward, thrusting his hand out to intercept the older man. "Gary, hey boss, I'm just teaching my sister." The veteran did not even blink. He walked past my brother's outstretched hand like the man was a piece of furniture. He blew past him without a word, without a glance, and stepped directly into my space. The old wolf recognized a member of the pack. There was no hesitation, no small talk. He snatched the paper target from the retrieval clip, held it up to the fluorescent lights and tilted it slowly. The single ragged hole, dead center, caught the light. He let out a low, quiet whistle. the kind of sound a man makes when he sees something that should not exist in a civilian range. His hands, the left one missing its index and middle fingers from an old operation, trembled slightly as he held the paper. Then he did something that made my brother's world crack in half. He fired off a highly classified operational countersign phrase, a verbal challenge used exclusively within special operations communities to identify friendly operators in the field. The words were quiet. The words were precise. The words were known only to people who had walked through the same fires I had walked through. I fired the correct response back without hesitation, the way I had done 100 times in 100 dark rooms and landing zones and smoke-filled corridors on the other side of the world. The veteran nodded slowly, his hard eyes softening for just a fraction of a second. "Welcome home," he said, 2 words that carried the weight of 1,000 shared horrors and a brotherhood that civilians would never understand, 2 words that my own family had never once thought to say. Then the veteran pivoted, his demeanor shifting from quiet recognition to volcanic rage. He stepped toward my brother and shoved him backward by the chest plate of his pristine, factory-creased tactical vest. The shove was forceful enough to send my brother stumbling into the bench behind him, his arms pinwheeling. "You told me she was logistics," the veteran barked, his raspy voice echoing off the concrete walls like a mortar blast. Every head on the firing line turned. Every conversation stopped. "Son, you just tried to teach a special operations officer how to shoot. She's one of the most lethal organisms in this state." My brother's face drained of every remaining drop of blood. His stubbornness twitched, fighting a losing war against the truth. His mouth opened and closed twice before words came out. And when they did, they were the words of a man whose entire identity was bleeding out on the floor. She counts underwear," he stammered, his voice cracking, clinging to the last rotting plank of the lie he had built his superiority on. The veteran stepped into my brother's face, practically spitting the words. "She counts dead bodies with her skill set. She could kill everyone on this firing line with a pencil before you even figured out how to flick off your safety." The words detonated like a fragmentation grenade in the center of the room. My brother's entire alpha male identity, the lifted truck, the Punisher stickers, the tactical vest, the internet expertise, the condescending lectures, the biological superiority complex, all of it collapsed into rubble at his feet. His friends stared at the ground, their faces white, humiliated and terrified, unable to look at me, unable to look at each other, drowning in the sudden understanding that they had spent the last hour mocking a woman who could end their lives with an office supply. The range was silent, the ventilation hummed, spent brass casings lay scattered across the floor like the wreckage of a destroyed ego. I picked up my range bag from the bench, I zipped it shut with one smooth pull. I slung it over my shoulder, turned my back on my brother and his crew and walked toward the exit. I did not look back. I did not say a word. I did not gloat. I did not explain. The quiet professional does not perform victory laps. The quiet professional completes the mission and moves to extraction. My boots crunched across the brass casings on the floor, each step echoing in the silence I left behind me. The glass door swung shut. The afternoon light hit my face, and behind me in that concrete room thick with gunpowder and shame, my brother stood surrounded by the wreckage of everything he had pretended to be. The air inside the Chevy Silverado was suffocating. The engine idled in the parking lot for a full 2 minutes before my brother finally turned the key. Neither of us spoke. He put the truck in reverse, backed out of the space with shaking hands and pulled onto the county road. He drove with both fists strangled around the leather steering wheel, his knuckles bone white, his eyes locked on the center line of the asphalt. He was not speeding anymore. He was not texting. He was not multitasking or lecturing or demonstrating warrior mindset. The man who had spent 45 minutes filling this cabin with his own voice could not produce a single syllable. His arrogance was dead. It had bled out on the concrete floor of the Patriot Range, right there between the spent brass casings and the shattered myth of his superiority. But his narcissistic selfishness was still twitching. I could see it in the way his jaw worked, the way his Adam's apple bobbed, the way his fingers squeezed and released the wheel in a nervous rhythm. He was not processing guilt. He was processing how to reframe himself as the victim. I had seen this pattern before. Not in combat, in interrogation training. The guilty party always pivots to self-pity before they attempt blame. It took him 6 miles. 6 miles of silence so thick I could hear the Silverado's engine ticking and the faint whistle of air leaking through the weather stripping on the passenger window. Then it came. "Why didn't you tell me?" he croaked, his voice cracking on the last word. the raw sound of a man who had just discovered that the foundation of his self-worth was made of wet cardboard. Why let me make a fool of myself? There it was, the narcissist's last stand. He was not apologizing. He was not asking how I was feeling. He was not acknowledging that he had spent 10 years belittling me, dismissing me, reducing me to a punchline. He wanted to know why I had allowed him to embarrass himself. His humiliation was the crime, not his cruelty. His public shame was the injury, not the decade of wounds he had carved into me at every family dinner, every holiday, every phone call where he reminded me that I was less than him. I slowly turned my head to look at him. I studied his profile the way I would study a target dossier, the sweat on his temple, the tremor in his lower lip, the bloodshot whites of his eyes. I delivered the psychological casualty report with the flat precision of a military debrief. No emotion, no drama, just cold operational fact. Because you never asked, I stated. The words landed in the cabin like a dropped hammer. He flinched. I continued without raising my voice. You needed me to be a failure so you could feel massive. You needed a weak little sister so you could play the strong big brother in front of your friends. The difference between us is that you need an audience to think you're strong. I paused for one beat, letting the silence twist. I just need to be myself. I pulled my phone from my hoodie pocket. I opened my banking app. I held the screen in front of his face, the glowing numbers cutting through the dim cabin light. $485,000. His eyes bulged. His foot wavered on the gas pedal and the truck lurched. He stared at the number the way a man stares at a car accident, unable to look away, unable to process what he was seeing. I pulled the phone back and slid up my left sleeve, exposing the jagged scar crossing my shoulder. Then I pulled the fabric of my sweatpants above my knee, showing the burn scar crawling up my thigh. I gave him the operational summary. Not the Hollywood version, the real version. The rooftop, the sniper round, the burning vehicle, the 3 men I dragged out while my skin melted, the commendations in the locked drawer, the classified operations that never happened on paper. I left no room for his delusions to hide. I sealed every exit. I collapsed every narrative he had ever constructed about who I was and replaced it with a truth so heavy and so undeniable that it pressed him into the driver's seat like G-force. Then I laid down the terms of unconditional surrender. I shifted my body in the seat to face him directly, my back against the passenger door, my eyes locked on his profile. My voice dropped low, steady, and absolutely final. Listen to me closely. The weak little sister is dead. Stop the lectures, stop the humiliation. If you don't, I will vanish. I have a family in camo ready to die for me. I sit at Mom's table out of blood loyalty, but I am not your doormat. Every word was a driven nail. Every sentence was a closed door. I was not negotiating. I was not asking for understanding. I was dictating the new rules of engagement, and the consequences for violation were permanent and total. He would lose me. Not temporarily, not until the next holiday, forever. And he knew with the gut-deep certainty of a man who had just watched me put 5 rounds through one hole that I possessed the absolute willpower to walk away and never look back. My family in uniform would close ranks around me, and he would never see me again. He swallowed hard, his throat clicked. The sound was audible over the engine. His hands loosened on the wheel and his shoulders collapsed forward. He looked smaller in that driver's seat than he had ever looked in his life. All the tactical gear, the lifted truck, the Punisher skulls, the bravado stripped away. Just a 46-year-old man sitting in the wreckage of the persona he had constructed to hide the fact that he had never done a brave thing in his life. His chin dropped toward his chest. I'm sorry, Betty, he whispered. The words were barely audible over the road noise. I did not respond. I turned back to face the windshield and watched the road unspool ahead of us. The apology was received. The terms were delivered. The operation was complete. Whether or not he honored the surrender was his problem, not mine. I had drawn the line in permanent ink, and I had the firepower to enforce it. 1 month later, the smoke from the backyard barbecue drifted over my mother's patio and curled up into the evening sky. The charcoal cracked and popped beneath a grill loaded with burgers and corn, and the warm smell of hickory and rendered fat floated across the yard. A ceasefire had been established, not the fragile temporary kind that collapses at the first provocation, but a real one, the kind enforced by undeniable truth. My mother had entirely stopped her snide comments about my career and my empty ring finger. She greeted me at the door with a hug that lasted 3 seconds longer than any hug I could remember. She set a place for me at the table without commentary, without comparison to her friend Linda's daughter, without the disappointed scan of my left hand. Something had shifted in the way she looked at me. My brother had told her, Not everything, not the classified details, but enough. Enough that the woman who had spent years pitying me now treated me with a cautious, newfound reverence, the kind you extend to someone you realize you have profoundly underestimated. My brother had traded his ridiculous tactical vest for a faded flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. The Punisher stickers were gone from the Silverado. He walked across the patio toward my lawn chair, tongs in one hand, a cold beer in the other. He moved differently now. The puffed-up strut was gone. The peacock posture had deflated. He stopped in front of my chair and stood there for a moment, the tongs hanging at his side. "Betty, I'm picking a defense site," he said, his tone stripped of condescension, stripped of performance, just a question. Red Dot or LPVO? There was no arrogance in the words, no lecture, just an amateur asking an expert with the quiet humility of a man who had finally accepted that he had been standing in the presence of a master and calling her incompetent. I gave him my recommendation, walking through the pros and cons the way I would brief a junior operator, clear and patient and direct. He nodded gratefully, absorbing every word without interrupting, without correcting, without adding a single thing he had heard on a podcast. Then he turned to his neighbor leaning on the back fence and pointed at me with the tongs. He pointed at me with the tongs, looking at his neighbor without a trace of sarcasm, genuine pride cracking through his voice. "Hey Dave, you ever meet my sister? She is Army Special Forces, a real Green Beret." The neighbor's eyebrows went up. My brother said it again like he needed to hear himself say it, like the words were a new language he was learning to speak. Then I felt a tug on my shirt sleeve, a small hand pulling gently. I looked down. My 8-year-old nephew Leo stood beside my lawn chair, looking up at me with wide, serious eyes. His dark hair was mussed from running around the yard, and he had a streak of ketchup on his chin. He clutched a plastic army figurine in his other hand, the kind you buy in a bag of 50 at the dollar store. "Dad says you're a real soldier," Leo said softly, his voice carrying the reverent hush of a child who has just learned that the fairy tales are true. "You're super strong. I want to be strong like you." I set my beer bottle down on the armrest. I swung my legs off the lawn chair and knelt down in the grass, bringing my face level with his. I put my hand on his small shoulder, feeling the bird-like fragility of his bones beneath his t-shirt. This was the moment that mattered, not the 5 rounds, not the veteran's recognition, not the shattered ego on the range floor, this right here, a child asking the right question. "Strong isn't about being loud or acting dangerous, Leo," I told him, keeping my voice steady and warm, making sure my brother could hear me clearly from his position at the grill. "True strength is staying calm when everyone else panics. It's protecting people who can't protect themselves, and it's knowing exactly who you are, even when no one is looking." Leo nodded slowly, his small face processing the words with a seriousness that made my chest tighten. He looked down at the plastic soldier in his hand, then back up at me. He did not fully understand yet. He was 8, but the seed was planted, and it was planted by someone who had lived every word of that lesson in blood and fire and silence. I ruffled his hair and he grinned and sprinted back across the yard to chase a firefly blinking above the fence line. I stood up, brushed the grass off my knees and walked over to the old wooden porch cooler. I popped the cap off a cold beer, the metal cap clinking as it hit the deck boards, and sat down on the porch steps. The condensation on the bottle chilled my fingers. The hickory smoke drifted past my face. The American flag hanging from the porch column rustled in the evening wind, its fabric catching the last amber light of the day. I had bled for that flag, I'd watched friends die under that flag, and I had suffocated inside this house, crushed beneath the weight of a family that could not see me, would not hear me, and refused to believe that a quiet woman in worn-out sneakers could be the deadliest person in the room. But the suffocating shell had been burned away. 5 rounds of 9 copper fired through a single hole at 7 yards had done what 10 years of silence could not. They had forced the truth into the light. And the truth, once spoken, could not be swallowed back. I did not have to split my soul in half anymore. I did not have to bury my strength to protect fragile egos. I did not have to choose between being a daughter and being a warrior. I was both. I was a daughter, a sister, and a Green Beret. I sat on my mother's porch drinking a cold beer, watching the flag move in the wind, listening to my nephew chase fireflies, and my brother ask genuine questions for the first time in his life. For the first time in my life, I was actually home. If you believe that true strength doesn't need to scream for attention, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Share your story in the comments below. Have you ever had to